Hi, this is Donna Harrell, board member of Wild West History Association. We're in historic Tombstone, Arizona, in the Tombstone Epitaph building. I'm here to talk on the James Younger Gang. The James Younger Gang is basically made up of the James brothers, Jesse and Frank James, and the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob Younger. The origins of the gang started in the Civil War. All of these men were partisan rangers for the Confederate Army. 1864, young Jesse James joined with Quantrell and other partisan rangers under William Bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse James stayed in Missouri, and under another command, they were headed in to surrender. They were attacked by drunken Union soldiers. Jesse James was shot in the lung. He was left for dead, picked up a couple of days later, and he was taken into town where he also formally surrendered. Jesse, being near death, was patched up as best as they could, sent back home. His family had been sent to Nebraska to get out of the area so they wouldn't be attacked. Jesse eventually somewhat recovered from his wounds. He always had trouble with the lung because he had been shot previously in the same lung, and according to Cole Younger, he had lost complete use of that lung. There was a meeting in early 1866 between a lot of other Confederate guerrillas and partisan rangers. The two younger brothers were there, as well as Frank James and very sickly Jesse James. They were trying to figure out what they were going to do. There was what's called the Drake Constitution in Missouri at the time, which was very strict Reconstruction. The men couldn't go to college. They couldn't work jobs. They were being chased by vigilantes. They didn't know what to do. They needed to support their families. They needed to support their homes. They decided that the best thing to do was to rob a bank and rob the Yankees. So on February the 13th, 1866 was the first daylight peacetime bank robbery. 14 men rode into Liberty, Missouri. They robbed the bank. They shot in the air and shot out of town. One young college student was killed in the raid. It's called a James Younger Gang raid, but it probably was a group of soldiers under another command that included Frank James and Cole Younger. But for modern history, it's what started the James Younger Gang. The James Younger Gang, their members went back and forth. A lot of different people came and went. It lasted from 1866 to 1881. Now the James boys, they were from a prominent family in Clay County, which is where Liberty was at. So a number of people recognized who Frank James was in the group. That college student had gone to William Jewell College, which is still a prominent Baptist college in Liberty, Missouri. One of the founders of that college was the father of the James boys, Reverend Robert James. Interestingly, Reverend James had a master's degree. Imagine how many people had master's degree in the 1850s living in western Missouri. So the James Younger Gang went on. They robbed banks, they robbed trains, the occasional stagecoach, Missouri, Kansas, Kentucky, Texas. The gang had very little trouble because the locals supported them. The banks in the Reconstruction era, they favored carpetbaggers, they favored Union supporters, northern supporters. Again, southern supporters couldn't run the banks. They couldn't be bank owners. So a lot of these bank owners, they wanted to get rid of southern sympathizers. So the local farmers, they would try to borrow from the banks. They would end up getting exorbitant interest rates and very strict terms that if they didn't comply and didn't make their payments on time, then the banks would foreclose immediately. So the Jameses and the Youngers and any of the other groups in Missouri that went after the banks or made life difficult for the banks, they were heroes. And if the Jameses and Youngers were in the area, their usual standard places to stay were not in caves, but were in hotels or with the local farmers. And the local farmers, they would pay the farmers for food and board. The farmers would get good cash and get to say, well, hey, Jesse James stayed in our farm, which was really a big thing, and they wanted them to continue coming through. The same was the railroads. The railroads had bought land or forced farmers to sell the land cheaply. So if the Jameses and Youngers, they would rob the express or rob the train cars and the passengers that were wealthy, that was okay. It's an interesting story. In the first train robbery the James Younger gang did in Missouri, they stopped the train. They took over the little town called Gad's Hill. They chose this town because Gad's Hill was a town that John Falstaff had robbed in one of William Shakespeare's plays. Well, Frank James was a student of Shakespeare, so he wanted to rob this town, the train at Gad's Hill, to be like John Falstaff. They went on the train, they went up and down the cars, the outlaws went up and down the cars, and they would ask the passengers if they had been Confederate soldiers. In that case, they would not rob them. They asked the men to look at their hands, and if the men had smooth hands or were wearing nice clothes, they robbed them. But if the men were wearing farmers' clothes or their hands were calloused, they didn't rob them, which of course improved their image to rob from the rich and give to the poor. Where in truth, although they were lavish in spending, they very rarely ever robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. They gave to themselves and they gave to their families. Again, they didn't stay in caves. They liked to travel. They probably took more trains to travel somewhere than they robbed them. They lived in hotels, they had fine clothes, the best guns, the best horses. Of course, the money didn't last long, and then they had to rob something else. In 1874, they had robbed the Gad's Hill. They had escaped, but they had gathered the attention of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. A couple of Pinkerton agents found Jim and John Younger in southern Missouri and St. Clair County. The two groups met up, the three Pinkertons and the two Younger boys. There was an exchange of conversation. The Youngers asked to disarm the Pinkertons. One of them kept a hidden gun, and during the conversation, he pulled the gun and he shot John Younger, who had done few, if any, robberies. Shot him in the neck, killing him. There was another exchange of gunfire. Jim Younger may have shot one of the other men, and it's known as the Roscoe Gun Battle. Another Pinkerton detective He had infiltrated a farm near the James Samuel farm. He sillily thought that he could go and offer himself to get work at the James Samuel farm, and they wouldn't notice that he had smooth hands and that he wasn't really a workman. But he ended up being found dead the next day with a gunshot wound, and they felt that the James Younger gang had, some members of them had shot this man. Things escalated. Alan Pinkerton, head of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, he decided that he wanted the Jameses and Youngers dead. He felt that the family, the parents of the James boys, their mother and stepfather, knew about the murder of one of his men, and he decided that that house needed to be destroyed and everybody in it. So in January of 1865, a group of Pinkerton detectives attacked the James Samuel farm, thinking that the James boys were there. It's unclear if they were. Most people believe that they weren't there at the time. They threw what is like a bomb in the window. There's a big iron case, half of it, that's still there and still at the farm. They pushed it into the fireplace. It exploded, cutting off part of Jesse's mother, Mrs. Samuel's arm at the elbow, and had to be later amputated. And then a young 9-year-old half-brother of the James boys was killed. There was outrage all over the country. People said, well, the James boys were bad, but not that bad, and this shouldn't have happened. There was a push to have them put through a pardon for the Jameses and the Youngers. It failed in the Missouri legislature, so that, that ended that, and they continued robbing. In August of 1876, one of them had a bright idea that they were going to expand their business and go to Minnesota to rob a bank. They took trains, they got up to Minnesota, they were in different groups, they stayed at hotels, they got horses, they trained the horses. They decided on robbing the bank at Northfield, Minnesota, on September the 7th, 1876. Two groups rode into town. The main group, they went into the bank. The other two were coming out to watch. Unknown why, but the main group that went into the bank had gotten a bottle of whiskey, and they weren't maybe drunk, but they were not what they should be mentally. The bank robbery went wrong. There was a shootout around town. Two of the James Younger gang were left dead in town. The others escaped. At the time, it was the largest manhunt in the country. Over 1,000 people were out looking for the Jameses and Youngers in the swamps of Minnesota. The James boys were able to get a horse. It was decided, since the Youngers were so wounded, that the James boys would ride off. Hopefully the posse would chase them and leave the Youngers alone to kind of get better before they made their escape. The Youngers and Charlie Pitts were captured. Charlie Pitts was killed, and Cole Jim and Bob Younger were captured. A couple of townsmen were killed in Northfield. The Youngers were accused of murder, although there was no real proof that specifically this Younger shot this person. They just wanted that, charged them with murder. The Youngers pled guilty, so they would have a life sentence as opposed to being tried and hung. They spent years in the Stillwater Penitentiary in Minnesota. Meanwhile, the James boys got away. They decided to kind of lay low for a while. Both of them had gotten married. Jesse James had married his cousin, Zerelda Z. Bims. Frank James had married Annie Roston. They moved their wives to Tennessee. They had family, they had friends there. They were going to go straight, raise their children. Jesse had a son, Jesse Edwards James, at that time. They got farms. Frank did some logging, hauled some logs. Jesse had a farm. They were living under assumed names. They got along with people. They put themselves in the community. They did really well until Jesse got sick. He had contracted malaria and out of the swamps in Minnesota. So he was very sick. His wife was expecting their next baby. He couldn't do his farming. Other neighbors came to help. Z went into premature labor, had twin boys. They needed doctors to help Z and the boys, who died within a week, both of them. And Jesse had all these medical bills, debts all over his area. So he picked up his family and wife and son and went to move with Frank, who was living around Nashville. Now, in an ironic situation, Jesse James, the bank robber, train robber, stagecoach robber, he contacted all of his creditors and the farmers that had helped him, and he said, I will pay you. He said, I will do whatever I can and I will pay you. And to his creditors, he tried to do 50 cents on the dollar, make deals with them, made agreements with them, and over the course of a year or so, he paid every penny back, except for one creditor who would not work with him. And he said, well, since you're not working with me, I am not paying you. But everybody else, all his farmers, all his neighbors, he paid every penny to. Frank James, they lived together for a while. There are some talk that they may have worked for a cedar bucket factory. There's a disputed photo that possibly is the members of the gang, Frank James and Jesse James, in this photo, that they did jobs. Jesse also bought a racehorse with Ed Miller, and they had a lot of success with that. And Jesse even did some jockeying and in the area. Frank had prize-winning pigs also. But Jesse didn't like that lifestyle. He couldn't make it. So he went back to robbery. He did some small robberies before coming back to Missouri to do a train robbery. Frank didn't really want to be involved, but he did so to support his brother. They had a couple of train robberies they did in Missouri, and then they tried to go back to live in Nashville. One of the gang members got drunk in a saloon store, blew off his mouth. They figured out who the guy really was, and the James boys figured that this guy would tell the authorities who they were and where they were, so they ended up moving back to Kansas City. Now, Frank eventually moved his family. They didn't stay in Kansas City. They moved to Baltimore, Maryland. Frank, his wife Annie, and their son Robert. Jesse James, he didn't care. He was going to stay in Kansas City. It was better to hide out in the open than hide off somewhere. So Jesse lived in town, and kitty corner across the street from him was the city marshal. And there was a vacant lot across the street. So Jesse's son and this marshal's son would play together, and the families interacted and stuff. And sometimes the marshal would gather a posse in the vacant lot across the street, and they would ask Mr. Howard or Mr. Jackson, depending on which alias that he was using at the time, do you want to join us? We're off going to look for the James boys, or we're going to look for Jesse James. We've heard he's off somewhere in the area. And he would make some excuse about his leg hurting or something, so he wouldn't join the posse. After Jesse died, the marshal was teased quite a bit because he had asked Jesse James to go look for himself. And that was a funny story that Jesse, I'm sure he had a great sense of humor. I'm sure he enjoyed the idea that the marshal was asking him to go look for himself. So eventually, Jesse made friends with a man named Charlie Ford. He and Charlie were great buddies. They traveled around together. Jesse was looking for places to rob, and they decided on a bank in Platte City, Missouri, which is fairly close to right now KCI Airport, kind of in that area. And Jesse, and with the help of Charlie Ford, moved his family from Kansas City to St. Joseph, Missouri. They needed men. The Youngers were gone. Frank was over it. He wasn't going to take part. Charlie said that his brother Bob would love to be involved in the robbery. So they got with Bob. What they didn't know, even Charlie didn't know, is that Bob had been talking to the sheriff and the governor. The governor had issued a large reward, dead or alive, for one or the other or both of the James boys. So Bob Ford wanted to be involved in that. He wanted to get that reward and get the notoriety that he had brought in Jesse James. In the home of the Ford boys' sister, there was a love triangle between their sister, a gang member, Dick Lydell, and another gang member known as Wood Height. Well, Wood Height was the James boys' first cousin. They had gotten into a number of altercations, and early in 1882, they had a gunfight. It was pretty useless. Wood and Dick were shooting each other and not really hitting each other, but Bob Ford took sides and he shot and killed Wood Height. They knew at that time that killing Jesse James's cousin meant the death sentence to them, because Jesse was totally for family and that he would come after him. At that point, Dick turned himself in. They hid the body of Wood Height on the farm. Bob increased his conversations with the authorities and told Charlie what was going on. Charlie was really friends with Jesse James, and he didn't want to do this to him, but he had to. He knew, as well as the rest of them, that being involved in the death of Wood Height and hiding that death was a death sentence. So the Ford boys were living with the James family, Jesse, Z, their son Jesse, and their daughter Mary, under the assumed name of Thomas Howard. They were living in St. Joe. They were going to the next day rob the bank at Platte City. The morning papers of April 3rd, 1882, was an account of the surrender of Dick Lydell. They had kept it out of the news for some time. Well, the Ford boys, especially Bob, they said that Jesse was questioning Why didn't the Ford boys know this? Why didn't they tell him? Because they had been in Kansas City. They should have heard something because they were such friends with Dick Liddell. They made up a story. They didn't know. But they had the feeling that Jesse didn't believe them. They left the breakfast table. They went into another room. It was a warm April day. And Jesse did what people now think of as the impossible. He turned his back on them and he was going to dust a picture. But he said the door and the windows were open. So he decided that he would take his guns off. He laid them on the bed in the little room and he got up on the chair with the duster and he was going to dust a photo. He was standing there, back turned to the Ford boys, completely unarmed. It was an opportunity of the lifetime. The Ford boys thought that he was going to kill them after this robbery because he suspected them of turning him in. So Bob Ford and Charlie Ford, they pulled their guns out. Bob Ford pulled the hammer back. Jesse turned slightly and Bob shot him in the back of the neck, in the back of the head. Jesse fell from his chair, standing there, fell on the floor. The family came in and Jesse James died right there. The Ford boys left the house, got word to the authorities that they had killed Jesse James. St. Joseph was pandemonium, people going to the house and looking at the body. One of the reasons that, people nowadays, they think, oh, well, he wasn't killed. It was somebody else. And over the years, there have been all these pretenders saying, I'm the real Jesse James. I'm Jesse James. Or Grandpa was Jesse James. One of the reasons that I believe, and most people believe, that it was really Jesse James that was killed is that in St. Joe, not only did they prop him up and they took pictures, when they got him they had people coming through looking at the body. And eventually they got him in the coffin and they had what we would call today a lying in state. And trains coming into St. Joseph, they would stop because people wanted to get off to go view the body of Jesse James. People that were friends, family, foes, lawmen, neighbors that known Jesse from childhood viewed the body and nobody said, that's not him. They all identified him. Later, when the body was taken by train to Kearney, Missouri, his hometown, again, it was a lying in state. And these were people that had grown up with Jesse again, and people that had fought in the war with him came and viewed the body, and nobody said, that's not him, that can't be him. Jesse was buried in the corner of the front yard of the family farm, and Frank James in Baltimore, he read about it in the newspapers. He said, let's try to get me surrendering. I'm the last one. I need to surrender. Eventually, in October of 1882, he surrendered, turned in a number of trials for this robbery or that robbery or a murder happened, was completely exonerated, found out not guilty. Jesse had been killed. They blamed the governor. They felt that it was an assassination. It was a cheap shot. He'd been shot in the back, unarmed. In the Old West, that's totally not good. And so Frank benefited from that feeling by Missourians who didn't want, no matter what the evidence was against Frank James, he was not going to be found guilty. Eventually, he was just let go. Went on, did odd jobs, sold shoes, was a starter at racetracks. He was a doorman at a theater. He did some theater work himself, did a little bit of acting, kind of went on with his life. The younger boys, in 1889, they were still in Stillwater Prison. Bob Younger died of tuberculosis in 1889. 1901, Jim and Cole Younger were given partial pardons. They couldn't leave the state of Minnesota, but they were able to move around the state, get jobs. Cole did very well. He loved the notoriety. Yeah, I'm Cole Younger. I used to be a robber. I'm an important person. He loved that people wanted to talk to him. Jim Younger hated that. He just wanted to be Jim Younger and forget the past. He didn't want to know anything about it and didn't like that people wanted to meet him because of the reputation as an outlaw. Well, ended up, Jim committed suicide. He couldn't take it anymore. Cole was given a full pardon, went back to Missouri, and he and Frank James joined up with the Wild West show, which they did a couple of years. Then they kind of went their own way. Cole Younger wrote a book, which part of it's very factual and part of it is really not. Just, he was a very windy type of guy, liked to tell stories. Frank James died at the family farm in February of 1915. Cole Younger died the next year at a home in Lee's Summit, Missouri. In the intervening years, Frank had died on the farm. The farm in Kearney, where Jesse was buried originally, became a tourist attraction, and his mother would get horseshoes at the local sales and sell those to tourists. Oh, these were on Frank's horse, or these were on Jesse's horse. And she would get old revolvers in sales and sell those to the tourists. She would even have the tourists, okay, if they wanted to take her picture, okay, for 25 cents, I'll let you take a picture. Or there were pebbles on Jesse's grave, and she would sell those. And then if there weren't enough, she would send somebody, one of the grandkids, to get more pebbles out of the creek to put back on the grave so she could sell. Frank wasn't as much of an entrepreneur when he ran the farm, but he still had a few things going. In 1902, they moved Jesse's body to the city cemetery to join with, his wife had died at that time. So they were buried together. And the James Younger gang has come through history. History has been very kind to them. History has been very kind to their descendants. Other descendants of some of the, we've seen on some of the other stories of WWHA members, they have a different experience. They felt ashamed because their relatives were seen as bad guys. And as a descendant of the Younger family, my families were always the good guys, even if they were bad guys. In all the movies, even though they were outlaws, they were the good guys. So I've found interesting some of the other stories of some of the other descendants and their experiences. And that's a good thing about the Wild West History Association. You've got authors, you've got historians, you got a lot of family members. I'm a descendant of the Younger family. My great-great-grandmother was a sister of the Younger boys. So I get a lot of stories and love for the subject from that. I also grew up in Clay County, which is where the James boys were from. So they were heroes. When I was in the 2nd grade, I was taught about the James boys because they were neighbors. They were heroes. We learned the song. You sang the song, the Ballad of Jesse James. And you went to the parade in Kearney because of Jesse James days. And it's just a different sort of thing because of the folk hero. part of that was made because of they had good press in their own day. People enjoyed hearing their stories and thought they were pretty cool guys, even if they were outlaws and living on the other side of the law. It's an interesting story, and WWHA presents those stories, not only for me as a James Younger Gang descendant, but other descendants and historians that love our history and love our family members as much as we do. So I encourage everybody who loves the Old West, any part of the Old West, to join the Wild West History Association and learn more about people of the past, people of the Old West, and even meet some people that know the story because they're family stories. Thank you. Goodbye.